Hey everyone, and welcome back to Trending Tidbits. Today we're tackling something that I think pretty much everyone listening has probably dealt with at some point. Anticipatory anxiety.
Oh, yeah.
It's that feeling you get before something that could be stressful even happens, and it can really hit us weeks or even months before the actual event.
Definitely not just regular nervousness.
It's a whole different beast.
Yeah.
So to really get a good grasp on it, we've got articles here from the ADAA, Medical News Today, Psych Central, and even the Calm blog to give us a well-rounded view.
Sounds like a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, so we're going to unpack this. Why does anticipatory anxiety happen? What does it look and feel like? And most importantly, how can we manage it?
That's what everyone wants to know, how to deal with it. A lot of people struggle with this one for sure.
For sure. Now think about this. Have you ever felt that pit in your stomach days before a big presentation?
Yeah.
Or maybe like that restless feeling leading up to a doctor's appointment?
Uh-huh.
Well, that's anticipatory anxiety in action.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often more than just those, butterflies.
Yeah. Right. It can really seep into your daily life, affect how you sleep. Your mood even leads you to avoid things altogether.
It really can.
The ADAA had this concept called 3 layers of fear
Oh, yeah.
that I thought was super helpful in breaking this whole thing down. And they use the example of a bee sting, but it can really apply to a lot of different situations.
I remember reading that. So the first layer is that basic fear of the thing itself. Like, I'm scared of bees,
Right.
you know.
Exactly. But then the second layer is where it gets a little bit more complex.
Okay.
It's the fear of the feeling of fear. So it's not just I'm scared of bees, but I'm scared of how panicked I'll feel if I see a bee.
And that can be even more intense than the original fear because you're anticipating not only this situation, but also your own reaction to it.
Exactly. And then the third layer is the fear of the entire situation because of that potential fear. So maybe you avoid going hiking because of potential bee encounters and the panic that might follow. Right. It's like your brain is trying to protect you by creating this bubble of avoidance around anything that might trigger that anxiety.
Yeah. It makes sense in a way, but it can be so limiting.
Oh, for sure.
Psych Central had this great quote that I think really captures this. Anticipatory anxiety is anxiety about anxiety. It's like our brains get stuck in this loop of worrying about worrying.
And it can show up in ways you might not even realize are connected to anxiety at first. The Calm blog actually mentioned things like losing interest in hobbies that you used to enjoy, feeling muscle tension, especially like in your neck and shoulders, even changes in appetite and sleep patterns.
I never thought about changes in appetite being linked to anxiety, but now that you mention it, I can totally see the connection.
Yeah.
It's like your body goes into that fight or flight mode,
Yeah.
even though the stressful event is still in the future.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Psych Central actually mentioned that while the physical symptoms can be similar to generalized anxiety disorder, the key difference is that the trigger for anticipatory anxiety is in the future.
So it's like our bodies and minds are on high alert, bracing for something that hasn't even happened yet.
Right.
No wonder it's so exhausting.
It really is. It's important to note that while everyone experiences anxiety differently, there are some common thought patterns that can often fuel anticipatory anxiety. These are called cognitive distortions.
Oh, yeah.
Those sneaky little thought traps.
I'm definitely prone to catastrophizing. My brain goes straight to worst case scenario.
That's a classic example of a cognitive distortion. Psych Central lists a few others like fortune telling, where you just know you're going to mess up a presentation, or mind reading, where you're convinced everyone is judging you.
It's like our brains become experts in predicting doom and gloom.
They really do. But the good news is that there are ways to recognize and challenge these distortions. And that's where tools like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT come in.
Okay, so let's talk about CBT. I know it's about changing those negative thought patterns, but I'm curious to hear more about how it actually works in practice, especially for anticipatory anxiety.
Well, with anticipatory anxiety, CBT can really help us interrupt that cycle, of predicting the worst and get back to reality. It teaches us to really examine those predictions, those thoughts, and ask ourselves, is this thought based on facts or just my fears?
So instead of just accepting, like, I'm going to bomb this presentation as a fact, CBT would encourage me to kind of dig a little deeper look for evidence.
Exactly. And often that evidence just isn't there. It's like you said earlier, our brains become experts at predicting doom and gloom, but CBT helps us put those thoughts on trial, so to speak.
I like that, putting those anxious thoughts on trial. So it's about learning to challenge those, Those automatic negative thoughts, those cognitive distortions that we were talking about.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. CBT helps us identify those patterns, the catastrophizing, the fortune telling, and then develop strategies to counteract them.
So what are some of those strategies? Like, what can we actually do to stop those negative thought spirals?
One common technique is called cognitive restructuring. It involves identifying the distorted thought, challenging its validity, and then replacing it with a more balanced and realistic thought.
Okay, you give me an example. Let's say I'm anxious about an upcoming job interview.
Sure. Let's say your automatic thought is, I'm going to mess up the interview and they'll never hire me. A CBT therapist might help you break down that thought and examine the evidence. Have you messed up every interview you've ever had? Are there other factors that might influence their decision besides your performance in the interview?
It's like taking a step back and looking at the situation more objectively.
Exactly. And then you can start to replace that negative thought with a more balanced one. Maybe something like, I'm going to prepare thoroughly for the interview and do my best. Even if it doesn't work out, it's a learning experience and there will be other opportunities.
That shift in perspective, I feel like, can make such a difference.
It can.
It's like taking the power away from those anxious thoughts.
Exactly. And CBT isn't just about changing our thoughts. It also equips us with practical tools to manage anxiety in the moment. We talked about relaxation techniques and grounding techniques earlier. Those are often incorporated into CBT treatment.
Right, those techniques help us regulate our nervous system and bring our attention back to the present moment. Can you give a quick example of a grounding technique? I think some people might not be familiar with them.
Of course. One simple grounding technique is the 5-4-3-2-1 method. It involves noticing 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. It's a quick way to shift your focus away from anxious thoughts and ground yourself in your senses.
That's a great one. It's amazing how powerful those little shifts in attention can be.
They really are, and that's what's so great about CBT. It gives you a toolkit of strategies that you can use in different situations to manage your anxiety.
So CBT is like a multi-pronged approach.
It is.
It helps you challenge those negative thoughts, but it also gives you these tangible tools to cope with, like, the physical and emotional symptoms of anxiety.
Exactly. Now, we've been focusing on, the downsides of anticipatory anxiety,
Right.
but is there ever a time when it can be, helpful?
That's an interesting question. I guess in some ways a little bit of anxiety can be motivating, right?
That's right. Think about it. If you aren't at all anxious about an upcoming exam, you might not study as hard.
Right.
A bit of anticipatory anxiety can help us focus our attention and energy on preparing for the event.
Yeah, it's like that saying, pressure makes diamonds. A little bit of pressure can actually push us to perform better.
Exactly. The key is finding that sweet spot where the anxiety is motivating, not debilitating.
It's all about finding that balance. But how do we know when anticipatory anxiety is becoming a problem that needs more attention?
There are a few key indicators to watch out for. First is the intensity. Is your anxiety so overwhelming that it's difficult to function?
So it's not just feeling a little nervous, it's feeling completely paralyzed by fear.
Exactly. Another factor is frequency. Are you constantly feeling anxious about future events, even minor ones?
So it's not just like a big presentation, it's like everyday interactions or, activities.
Precisely. And then there's duration. We know anticipatory anxiety can start weeks or even months before an event. But if those feelings persist for an extended period, it might be a sign that you need some extra support.
So if we're noticing that our anxiety is intense, frequent, and long-lasting, that's a good indicator that professional help might be beneficial.
Absolutely. And it's also important to consider the impact on your life. Is your anticipatory anxiety preventing you from doing things you enjoy, reaching your goals, or maintaining healthy relationships?
That's a really important point. Anxiety shouldn't hold us back from living our life to the fullest.
It shouldn't, and there are many effective treatment options available, so there's no need to suffer in silence.
Speaking of treatment options, I know we briefly mentioned medication earlier.
Yes?
But can you talk a little more about the role of medication in managing anticipatory anxiety?
Sure. Medication can be a helpful tool for some people, especially when combined with therapy. Anti-anxiety medications can help reduce the physical symptoms of anxiety, while antidepressants can help regulate mood and reduce overall anxiety levels.
So medication can kind of provide some relief while you're working on, developing those coping skills and strategies in therapy.
Exactly. It's important to remember that medication isn't a magic bullet. It's most effective when used as part of a comprehensive treatment plan.
That makes sense.
Mm,
Now, you mentioned that there are other types of therapy besides CBT that can be helpful for anticipatory anxiety. Can you tell us a little more about those?
of course. Another common approach is acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. ACT focuses on accepting uncomfortable thoughts and feelings rather than trying to fight them.
So instead of trying to get rid of those anxious thoughts, ACT teaches you to kind of make space for them without letting them control your behavior.
Exactly. ACT also emphasizes identifying your values and taking actions that align with those values, even in the presence of anxiety.
That sounds really empowering. It's about living a meaningful life, even if anxiety is part of the equation.
Precisely. And then there's exposure therapy, which we touched on earlier. Exposure therapy involves gradually confronting the things you fear in a safe and controlled environment.
So if someone's anticipatory anxiety leads them to avoid social situations, exposure therapy might involve starting with small, manageable exposures, like going to a coffee shop with a friend and gradually working up to more challenging situations.
Exactly. The idea is that by repeatedly exposing yourself to the things you fear, you can start to learn that they're not as dangerous as your brain might be telling you.
Right. That makes sense. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to treating anticipatory anxiety.
There isn't.
It's about finding the right combination of strategies and therapies that work for you.
Absolutely. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about some fascinating research that sheds light on what's actually happening in the brain during anticipatory anxiety. There's a study that wasn't included in our initial source list that I think you'll find really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. I love learning about the science behind things.
Well, researchers at the University of Maryland used fMRI, which is a brain imaging technique to study brain activity during anticipatory anxiety. They found that when people anticipate something unpleasant, a specific network of brain regions becomes activated.
So they can actually see what's happening in our brains when we're feeling anxious. That's
It
incredible.
really is. And one of the key players in this network is the amygdala.
The amygdala, isn't that the part of the brain that's involved in processing fear?
Exactly. The amygdala is like our brain's alarm system. It's constantly scanning for potential threats. And when we anticipate something dangerous or unpleasant, it goes into overdrive, triggering a cascade of physiological responses, increased heart rate, sweating, rapid breathing, all those classic anxiety
So
symptoms.
it's like our brains are sounding the alarm even though the threat is still in the future.
Exactly. And another key player is the bed nucleus of the estria terminalis, or BNST for short.
Yeah.
The BNST is a brain region that's closely connected to the amygdala, and it's particularly involved in processing anxiety related to uncertain threats.
Uncertain threats. So when we don't know if something bad is going to happen or when it might happen.
Exactly. And that's why anticipatory anxiety can be so persistent and difficult to control.
So
Our brains are wired to be vigilant for potential threats, even when those threats are ambiguous.
that's like our brains are constantly playing what if, trying to anticipate every possible scenario.
Yeah. And then we have the frontal lobes, which are the most highly evolved part of our brains, involved in planning decision making and regulating our emotions.
Huh.
During anticipatory anxiety, the frontal lobes try to manage those anxious feelings and help us make rational decisions. But sometimes the amygdala and the BNST can hijack those efforts, leading to impulsive behaviors or avoidance.
So it's like there's this battle going on in our brains between the fear centers and the control centers.
That's a great way to put it. And the outcome of that battle can depend on a variety of factors: our individual brain chemistry, our coping skills, the support we have in our lives.
This is all so fascinating. So this fMRI research is helping us understand the biological underpinnings of anticipatory anxiety. What are some of the practical implications of these findings?
Well, for one, it validates the experience of people who struggle with anxiety. It shows that anxiety is a real physiological experience happening in the brain, not just all in your head.
It's not a weakness or a character flaw, it's a biological response.
Exactly. And that understanding can be really empowering. It takes away some of the shame and self-blame that often accompanies anxiety.
It's like knowing that there's a scientific explanation for what you're feeling.
Exactly. These findings also have implications for treatment. By understanding the specific brain circuits involved in anxiety, researchers can develop more targeted therapies. For example, there's promising research on the use of transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to modulate activity in the amygdala and other brain regions involved in anxiety.
TMS, that sounds intriguing. Can you explain a little bit more about how it works?
TMS uses magnetic pulses to stimulate specific areas of the brain. It's a non-invasive procedure that's been shown to be effective in treating depression, and early research suggests it can also be helpful for anxiety disorders, including anticipatory anxiety.
So it's like they're using magnets to rewire the brain.
In a sense, yes, and the exciting thing is that this is just one example of the cutting-edge research being done on anxiety disorders. There's so much potential for developing new and innovative treatments.
It gives me hope for the future. We've covered so much ground today. The definition of anticipatory anxiety, how it manifests, the factors that contribute to it, coping strategies, treatment options, and even this fascinating brain research.
We have, and I think the key takeaway here is that anticipatory anxiety is a common human experience. It's something that most, if not all of us, struggle with at some point in our lives, but it's important to remember that it doesn't have to control us.
Absolutely. We have the power to understand our anxiety, develop coping mechanisms, and seek support when we need it.
Exactly. And by doing so, we can live fuller, more fulfilling lives.
I love that. Now, I know we're just about out of time for today's trending tidbits, but before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea that anticipatory anxiety is often based on predictions, not facts. Can you expand on that a bit?
It's a really important point. Our brains are kind of wired to scan for potential threats, but they often get stuck in this loop of predicting the worst possible outcomes,
Right.
even if those predictions aren't based on reality.
Yeah, we end up creating all this anxiety based on what-ifs that may never actually happen.
That's right. We let those predictions run wild and forget to question whether they're, based on actual facts or just our fears and anxieties.
So how can we get better at, questioning those predictions? Are there any strategies that can help us kind of separate fact from fiction?
Absolutely. One helpful strategy is to ask yourself, what is the evidence for this thought?
Okay.
Is it based on something concrete or is it just a feeling?
So if I'm anxious about a presentation, instead of thinking I'm going to mess up and everyone will judge me, I should stop and ask myself, what evidence do I have that this will happen?
Exactly. And often when you really examine the evidence, you'll find that it's pretty flimsy. Maybe you've given successful presentations in the past, or you've gotten positive feedback on your work.
Right. It's like we need to become detectives of our own thoughts, looking for clues and evidence to support or refute those anxious predictions.
I love that analogy. Another helpful tip is to focus on what you can control. So instead of getting caught up in all the what ifs,
Yeah.
shift your energy towards taking positive action.
So if I'm anxious about that presentation, instead of dwelling on, all the ways I could mess up, I could focus on practicing my delivery, getting feedback from a trusted friend, or even like visualizing myself giving a successful presentation.
That's a great example. By taking proactive steps, you're not only preparing for the event, but you're also building your confidence and reducing those feelings of helplessness.
Yeah. It's about reclaiming a sense of agency, you know, reminding ourselves that we're not just passive victims of our anxiety.
Right.
We have the power to take action and influence the outcome.
And that can be incredibly empowering. Of course, even with the best preparation, things don't always go exactly as planned, but that's okay.
Right.
We all make mistakes. We all have setbacks. It's part of being human.
It's about learning from those experiences and building resilience, right? Not letting setbacks define us.
Exactly. And just as importantly, we need to remember to celebrate our successes, even the small ones. Every time we face our fears and manage our anxiety, we're building strength and confidence for the future.
So true.
Yeah.
It's about giving ourselves credit for all the hard work we're doing to manage our anxiety. And I think it's a great note to end on.
I agree. If there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this trending tidbits, it's that anticipatory anxiety is something you can learn to manage.
Yeah, it's not about eliminating anxiety completely. It's about understanding it, developing coping mechanisms, and reaching out for support when you need it.
And remember, you are not alone. Anticipatory anxiety is a common human experience, and there are effective tools and treatments available. Don't hesitate to reach out to a therapist, counselor, or doctor if you need extra support.
That's so important. Seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into anticipatory anxiety. We hope you found it informative and empowering.
We did cover a lot of ground.
We sure did. If you're looking for more information, be sure to check out the show notes for links to all the sources we discussed today, plus some additional resources that might be helpful.
Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.
And remember, you've got this. We'll be back soon with another Trending Tidbits exploring a new topic.